Welcome to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Open University. Today we are going to discuss about the Sufism, its principles and the orders and how it impacted the Indian society. So we have this program is for UG first year students of second semester and PG first year second semester students of history. And this is a very important aspect of the medieval Indian history. And Sufism, everyone knows about the Sufi saints because the dargahs are there in a nook and corner of the villages in all over India, and we see them very simple, kind of learned intellectuals who find solace. People will go to the dargahs, khankas, to to get solace to their those who are in distress, those who want to learn more, those who want to have peace, they go there and listen to the saints and then find solace in their lives. So this Sufism, which along with the Bhakti movement, impacted medieval Indian society in several ways. This kind of an amalgamation of both the religious doctrines and the practices with the simplicity, with the principles of love, patience and perseverance, and also a kind of fraternity, the brotherhood, and they wanted that God can be reached directly, not with the help of any intermediates. So this unique kind of Sufism impacted Indian society in politically, socially, religiously, and in art and architecture, music forms, in several ways, in the polity too. So how we are going to what is Sufi, the term about, and how it is evolved or traveled to India from Persia, and then what are the orders, and who are the Sufi saints and the prominent Sufi saints, and the silsilas, the orders, and the doctrinal principles, and how women marginalized and downtrodden throng into the orders, listen to the Sufis, and how equality is pronounced in the Sufism. All these aspects are going to be discussed in this teleconference for 1 hour, and the students can ask questions after the learned experts are here. I am going to introduce them. Professor Rekha Pande ji, she is a professor of history and also in women's studies from Hyderabad Central University. A senior professor, ma'am has immensely worked for the development of the subject, and namaste ma'am, and welcome to our studios. And she also worked as a co-founder of the Women's Studies Center at Manu, and she has put up more than 50 years of experience as an academic, as an interventionist in social activities, as a policy maker at national and international level. And madam has done successfully 42 projects, research projects, and produced 25 students, PhD scholars and 40 other MPhil scholars. And madam was a visiting fellow at the Institute of Birkbeck, University of London, University of Buffalo, USA, University of Artois, Arras in France, and also the assessor, NAC Accreditation Council, as an assessor, she toured extensively. We are so glad to have you, ma'am, in our studios, and our learners are very fortunate to have your inputs on the topic given. And I welcome Namaste Ikram, Dr. Ikram, who is a very young and upcoming scholar from Maulana Azad National Urdu University. Dr. Ikramul Haque is a scholar of medieval Indian history with a specialization in the Indo-Persian historiography of Islam and Sufism in India. And he is also expert in intellectual history and early modern South Asia, and takes particular interest in manuscript studies, history of book prediction, and also he did his research from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and he has several books to his credits and chapters in books, and he is also a visiting fellow at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, Oxford, where he recently returned from Oxford after completing his research for 6 months. So, he published several articles in the reputed journals and chapters in books, and also into the projects, taking up the several research projects. Welcome Dr. Ikram to our studios. Namaste.
Thank you very much.
And today this topic we are going to discuss for at least 40 minutes. After that the students are allowed to ask questions, and the number, please note down the number, those who are viewing, the learners, 040-23680-456. I repeat, 040-23680-456. This is a number the students can call to the studios and get your questions or doubts clarified by the eminent experts. And I myself, Professor Sudhar of the Department of History here, and we are going to discuss very extensively about Sufism, because along with the Bhakti movement, Sufism flourished in medieval India, as I was telling about. And to begin with, we will know from Professor Rekha Pande ma'am about what is Sufi, the term Sufi denotes, and who is a Sufi, by the way?
Thank you very much, Professor Sudhar, Rani, and I am very happy to be part of this discussion along with Ikram. And as far as the word Sufism is concerned, it comes, the Arabic word for this is tasawwuf, and it is a mystical dimension of Islam, where the emphasis is on inner purification and divine love. It talks about a direct personal communion with God. The core basic beliefs of Sufism are to seek truth through a direct communion with God and to experience God directly. It also talks a lot about self-purification, tazkiyah, that is stripping away one's ego and being away from all kinds of worldly desire. Another very important aspect of Sufism is the unity of being, Wahadat al-Wujud, that is the idea that all that exists is a manifestation of God. Having said that, it is very important to remember that all Sufis still adhere to the Islamic law, Sharia and theology, but they try to maintain a balance between the two. Some of their very important practices are dhikr, that is repeating and remembering the name of God. Sama or Qawwali is where they gather together, they sing praises of God. There is also, in some cultures like in Turkey, etc., you have whirling saints who go around, and their whole dance symbolizes a cosmic harmony. It also talks about markaba, that is the meditation and to be one with God. Now, as far as the origin of Sufism is concerned, there is a lot of discussion among scholars. It originates in a place called Basra in Iran. Now, some say that the word Sufi is derived from the Arabic word safa, which means pure, purified of any kind of worldly passion. And these were people who didn't have any kind of worldly passion. Others say that it is derived from the word saf, that is people who are first in rank. They are the people who are very close to the Supreme Being Allah, and they are in communion with God directly. And the third say that it is derived from the word suf. This is the garment which these Sufis wore. It was something which was
the rough garment.
Yeah, a rough garment which was undyed. And we find that, when you read the Quran, there are two kinds of revelations which are there. One is called the Ilme Safina. This is a knowledge which is there in the Quran, and it is available to everyone. The custodians of this are the ulema. The second is the Ilme Sina. that is the knowledge of the heart, and the custodians of this become the Sufis, and they are the one, you know, who really understand this. They are in direct communion with God. So that is how the word originated.
Thank you, ma'am, for elaborately discussing about the word Sufi and the Sufi science. And Ikram, Tarachand calls Sufism as a stream.
Right,
you know,
right.
A stream that, you know, goes on, you know, increasing its volume when it goes on, adding the tributaries. So I could see that, you know, Indian society already, Buddhism, Jainism,
right,
and Vedic Brahmanism, and Hinduism, and Christianity, you know, all this Islam has entered, you know, all these religions amalgamated, like, you know, they are influencing each other and all. I would like to, you know, ask you about the, ma'am talked about the origin of Sufism, how it entered into India, and what forms it takes, as in the words of Tarachand, you know, how it's just assimilating all these cardinal principles of the existing religions in India.
Thank you, Professor Sudhar, Rani, for having me. Well, this is a very interesting question. We must understand the basic fact that Islam is essentially, Sufism is essentially Islamic in nature. But it is also true that it, over the years, it assimilated and imbibed elements from the local culture, from local religion, which is a very classic case in the case of South Asia, and a very distinct one. As Professor Rekha Pande explained and elaborated that how Sufism emerged very early on. In fact, in the Sufi circle, the Sufi believes that the Prophet Muhammad himself was the first Sufi. And the moral foundation and the fundamental basis of the principle of Sufism is found in the Quran and the Hadith, because the basic ideas such as love and devotion, compassion, service of humanity, all of these basic principles are derived from the fundamental teachings of Quran and Hadith in that way. But this was an idea. The movement, as Professor Rekha Pande explained, began in the 8th century in Iraq, Kufa and Basra, and then traveled all the way from Iraq to Khurasan, Iran. And I believe that Sufism entered India, particularly the northwest region of the Indian subcontinent, places like Sindh and Multan, somewhere in the 11th century. And this is the time when, by that time, the Sufism had actually, as a movement, had matured, in the sense that now the Sufis are organized and very structured into movement, what we call silsila or tariqa. So the first very important Sufi who arrived in Lahore was Ali Huzwari. And Ali Huzwari wrote a very powerful and important book called Kashf al-Mahjub. And the book is very significant because this is the first ever book on Sufism that was written in Persian. And it was written in the Indian subcontinent in Lahore towards the end of the 11th century. The book is also very significant in the sense that it talks about different Sufi branches and groups that had emerged by that time. And it also explains and elaborates certain Sufi terminologies and concepts which had become very popular in the parts of Central Asia and Iraq.
He provided a metaphysical basis of the Sufism.
Yes.
So that's
Sufism.
the most important
Yes,
part of
yes. And today he's remembered as the Data Ganj Bakhsh.
Yes.
And the people flocked to his grave. So from 11th century onwards, the Sufism as in the form of a movement, in the form of silsila, actually began with the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate from the 13th century onwards. So we have powerful Sufi silsilas like Chishtis, like Sohrawardis, and then later on in the 16th century, Qadiris and Naqshbandis. And it is very interesting to see that the account of a 14th century traveler, Shihabuddin al-Umari, and he wrote a book called Masalikul Amsar. If you read that book, in that book he explains that there are so many khanqahs and so many Sufi lodges in India that they can actually go up to thousands and hundreds, which explains that only Delhi as a city in the 13th and 14th century was littered and was populated by a lot of Sufis, and the other parts in the Doab and in the Sindh and Multan up to Bengal. So the Sufism began very late as compared to the other regions in the Islamic world in the 11th century, but then it proliferated and spread, and the Sufism disseminated to other parts very quickly in India.
Okay, thank you, Ikram, for your very extensive discussion on the beginning of how Sufism traveled in India. Madam Rekha Pande, like Sufism, Sufis are aesthetics that they wander around the places and preaching the love and brotherhood, self-discipline, and they don't have any particular code of for themselves, like no common book as it is, and so they accepted Muhammad as the first prophet, and then Quran as a sacred book. But what are the core ideas that they propagated and the principal teachings of the Sufi science and Sufism?
Yeah, okay. Sudha, when you, as Ikram had mentioned, if we look at the whole development of Sufism, we can clearly see two distinct phases. Initially, when it started till about 19th century, this was merely a system, tendency. It was still not a system. It had not developed any kind of ideas or philosophy. But most of the Sufis were primarily recluse, they were ascetics, they were based in headquarters like Basra and Kufra, and there were two very important aspects of this phase. There was a lot of renunciation among the Sufis, and second, there was a lot of fear of the judgment of Allah. But slowly, as we see after 9th century, it becomes more developed. Like Ikram has already mentioned, it is by the end of, beginning of 11th century that it comes to India. But then slowly by 9th century, it develops with its own philosophy. There is a pantheistic mysticism, a doctrine which comes in, which identifies God with the universe. And we find that from here, there is their basic teachings are, they talk a lot about union with God, unity of being. They talk about a lot of equality, everybody being equal. But then, in order to become a Sufi, they had very clearly marked about 7 stages. These are called the muqamats. And we find that a peer becomes very essential. Peer is a master who guides his murid in order to become disciple, in order to become Sufi. And but what is important is, even if you pass these 7 steps, ultimately it is the fazl or grace of God which is very important for you to become a Sufi. Only God can give that fazl. And the end is fana, annihilation with annihilation of the self with God. So, when they talk about the different stages, the first stage is called ubudiyat. This is, when a person starts realizing that, they are somebody special, they want to reach God. So this is a step in preparing for that journey. So this is the first step where a realization comes inner realization comes in that you are, ready to go on this path and become one with God. And second is, it talks about ishq, the love of the divine. There is so much love of the divine that everything else takes a secondary place in your life. And then after this comes zuhd. And in zuhd, you start renouncing the worldly pleasure. And only, love of God is something which becomes very important. this is followed by a fourth step called was, where that person goes in ecstasy and they keep repeating the name of God continuously. And then, there is a fifth stage where a hakikat dawns on that person, and in this hakikat, their heart is illuminated with the nature of God. And as a result of this, finally, when they this hakikat dawns on them, there is a wasl or union with ultimately the God. And this leads to the final stage where both, the Peer and the Murid, both of them become one. There is fana, which is called you become amalgamated in God. So, these are the various steps through which one becomes Sufi, and that is how their whole philosophy developed.
Very good, ma'am. Like, beautifully you, in a nutshell, 7 stages of the Sufi renunciation or the union with the God has been explained. Ikram, about the orders, some estimates as many as 175 orders are there, and according to Abul Fazl, he says that 14 Sufi orders are there. But we can't find that many orders, Sufi orders, silsilas in Indian context. So I just want you to talk about the major Sufi orders in general and in India, and also the geographical spread, because this is more important. Northwest you talked about, how about the Deccan? How they travel to the South India, and then in Telangana villages, you find the dargahs, in Warangal, very ancient and old dargahs, and in Aurangabad and Deccan states and all. So how this happened, the spread of Sufism to the nook and corner of Indian geographical areas. So I just want to know about this, about the silsilas and their geographical spread about this.
Well, there were, as you rightly pointed out, that Abul Fazl mentions 14 Sufi orders, but some of them are very small and maybe so negligible that we don't find their traces. But there were 4, 5 or 6 Sufi silsilas which considerably impacted the social and cultural landscape of South Asia. There was, for example, during the Delhi Sultanate, the centuries between starting from 13th century onwards, there were 2 very important Sufi silsilas. One was the Chishti silsila and the other was the Suhrawardi silsila. The Chishti silsila was introduced by Khaja Muinuddin Chishti in the beginning of the 13th century. He settled himself in Ajmer, where he established his Khanqa. And Chishti silsila went on to become perhaps one of the most significant and popular Sufi orders in the entire South Asia. And it produced luminous and illustrious Sufis during the course of time. Shaykh Muinuddin Chishti was succeeded by his Khalifa, Khaja Bakhtiyar Kaki in Delhi, and he was succeeded by his own Khalifa, Baba Farid, who established his Khanqa in Ajodhan, Pakpatan, modern day Pakistan. And in Delhi, Nizamuddin Auliya became the most popular Sufi saint, who was not only popular because a lot of people came to his dargah, but he was also popular because he treated the non-Muslim people very differently.
Sheikh Salim Chishti also.
Yes, during the Mughal times, Sheikh Salim Chishti. So the Chishti silsila became very popular, particularly in Delhi, in northwest in Multan, and then in Bengal, or in the entire Doab region. The other Sufi order, the Suhrawardi silsila, which was initially introduced by Khaja Bahauddin Zakaria. The silsila was established by Sheikh Shihabuddin Suhrawardi in Central Asia. Sheikh Shihabuddin Suhrawardi sent his disciple Khaja Bahauddin Zakaria to Multan, where he established his Khanqa and he started preaching. So the Sindh or the Multan, the northwest region, became the center of Sohrawardi Silsila, and then one of his disciples went to Bengal where he established his Khanqa, and then Deccan.
But
a very interesting,
Ikram, not like Chishtis.
Right.
Suravardis accepted the patronage.
Right.
Royal patronage, and luxuries.
Right.
And they followed Islam also very strictly.
Very strictly.
They didn't really.
Both these silsilas had a very different orientation to the state, to the society, and to Sharia as well. And then if there's a question, we'll talk about it more. And then, as you rightly pointed out, that the Sufi silsilas, the Sufi orders, actually from the Delhi and other parts, then it traveled all the way from the north to the Deccan. And it happened in the 14th century. First, with Alauddin Khalji, he conquered Daulatabad, which is Deogir. Yeah. And we find instances and examples in the Sufi literature. For example, Nizamuddin Auliya asked some of his disciples to go and settle in Daulatabad. But the full-blown migration of the Sufis and ulama happened after Muhammad Tughlaq conquered the Deccan, established his power, and transferred what is called the second capital of Delhi. And that is when a lot of Sufi saints, Sheikh Burhanuddin Gharib Nawaz and Khaja Banda Nawaz Gesudaras, who are very prominent Sufis.
Maula Ali Dargah,
they all came and settled.
Nizams,
yes. But this was the Delhi Sultanate.
Yeah.
In the 16th and 17th centuries, we had two very prominent Sufi orders during the Mughal times, the Qadris and the Naqshbandis. And the Qadri order found a very devout and very popular disciple in Dara Shikoh.
Yeah.
Dara Shikoh, along with Shah Jahan, once visited a Qadri saint in Lahore, Mian Mir, and then he was so infatuated by his teaching that he was initiated into the order by Mullah Bakhshi. And the Naqshbandi order, again in the 16th century, was introduced by Khaja Baqi Billah, and one of a very important Sufi saint of this order was Shaykh Ahmad Sarhandi, and in the 18th century Shah Walillah Muhaddis Dehlvi. So if you see that the Sufi orders, right from Multan and Sindh up to Bengal, and then in the Deccan, Daulatabad, Deogir, they established their Khanqas, they built their order, they initiated people into their silsilas, and that is how the Sufism and its philosophy disseminated all over.
And Naqshbandi also Khwaja Baqi.
Khwaja Baqi Billah introduced the order.
Yeah. And how about this Firdausi silsilas and Shattari silsilas?
They were also very important. For example, the Firdausi silsila had a very important and significant Sufi in Bihar, in Shaykh Yahya Maniri. And Shattaris became very popular during the Mughal times, in the early 16th century, and the Mughals had a very close, particularly Humayun had a very close relationship with Shattaris. So they were not as significant or as popular.
So very minor sects.
As the Chishtis.
But Sudha, I want to tell you one thing, and I think Ikram will agree with me, that in spite of having so many silsila, it was only the Chishti silsila which became
very prominent,
popular. And what is the reason
in southern India too, like in Deccan and South India.
Maybe people found, they emphasized, they were not very strict followers of Islam. They emphasized a lot on music, and the chella, and maybe people found a lot of semblance with their own day-to-day.
Yeah, they assimilated local culture, they adopted local language, vernacular language.
And yes, this orders, so how beautifully they are spread along with the every entire geographical area of India. And Madam, I just Rekha Pande garu, like Sufism, its organizational structure and major institutions are there. Like how it is been organized. Sufism as an order, as a silsila, and what are the institutions they developed, and the Khanqa, Pir Murid relation you are talking about, and the Khanqas, the role of Khanqas, and Dargahs and all, these institutions, how they have been established, and which order gave more prominence to this?
when you look at it, the growth of Sufism in India, we find that they had a very rich institutional framework, especially to sustain the spiritual practices. And they developed major organization, as has been mentioned, the silsilas or the order. I think Ikram has mentioned in detail the various silsilas, how they developed. Then you also had a lot of khankas, the hospices which came in, and the shrines, the dargah. And at the heart of all these three institutions lies the peer and murid relationship,
Right.
the master and the disciple relationship. And it was through this that they structured authority. There was a transmission of teachings and a communion of the whole communal life, which was very important for the Sufis. And if you look at it, the Chishti Silsila, as we've already discussed, played a very major role. You had people like, people still identify and they are very popular in India. If you, Baba Farid, Nizamuddin Aulia, even Amir Khusro for that matter, he was a very important Sufi, and he is very much responsible for the assimilation of local culture, the development of Hindavi with Persian and
The Karnataka
Hindi.
Kankas are
Very important, yeah. And then, every order, whether it is Shoharwardi order or the Qadri order or the Naqshbandi order, they had their own institutional frameworks, and you had a large number of people who were visiting these. And the difference was, some of the Sufi silsilas were very close to the ruling authority.
Yeah.
They had good relationship. They were very active, especially if you look at it, the Suharwardis were very active in politics. They had very close relationship with the rulers. And the others, if you look at the Qadri order, they emphasize a lot of asceticism. They had strict adherence to Islamic law. And we find that the Naqshbandi order emphasized a lot of silent meditation, sobriety, but they had a lot of reform zeals. So, each had its own strength.
Somewhere it is written like, Ba Sharia and
Be-Sharia. And how
is
they
that existed in the, because all of them believed in Islam. And Sharia, followed the Sharia.
Some followed it very strictly, some were very liberal with it. If you look at it, the Chishtis were very
we can't
liberal.
say it Be Sharia. We say only Ba Sharia with the little variations in
Which is there.
adherence, strictly adherence to the ritualism and liberalism at one place.
Beshara were the ones who actually flouted the fundamental obligatory practices of Islam, such as prayer or fasting. So that is why they were called that. They are Beshara, that they are openly flout those obligatory rituals that Islam.
So Bashariya.
Bashara is the ones who follow and they operate within the ambit of
Islam orders.
But they take the liberty and then they also express their inner feeling.
Ma'am talked about, Rekha Pandeji was talking about politics, like, I just, it's very interesting because the emperor like Akbar taking advice of the Chishti saints, and, he visited almost, 7 to 9 times in his lifetime to provide amenities and to, expand and to construct dargah and all. And Prince Darashikoh himself was a Sufi saint. And coming to this, it's very interesting when it comes to the disintegration of the Mughal Empire. There are several regional, provincial states emerged. And we don't have much evidences or sources about their, Bengal, Jaunpur, and especially Jaunpur. We come across like, only the works of Sufi saints.
Right.
And based on the works of the Sufi saints, the Jaunpur history has been constructed like, we know something about the kings, that the king ruler, and the matter of the polity, administration, religious and socio-economic conditions in Jaunpur states. So when it comes to this, this much, it's one place we are talking about the saints, they lead asceticism, and they went to the people, not looked towards the patronage, but they impacted the polity also.
Yes.
So could you please tell about those instances or instances of history where they made a major impact in polity?
Well, the Sufis' role in politics is very mixed.
Yeah.
In the sense that not all Sufis, let's say, cooperated with the state or with the ruling authority. As Professor Rekha Pande initially explained, that the Chishtis, there were distinct characteristics as far as the relationship with the ruling class and state is concerned between the Chishtis and the Sohrawardi's. The Chishtis were against any kind of cooperation with the state or with the ruling authority. The Sohrawardi's, they actually believed in very active cooperation with politics and with the Sultan of Delhi. And we get examples of this in the Sufi literature. For example, there is a very important Sufi Malfuz literature. It's called Fawaidul Fuad. And it is a book of conversation of Nizamuddin Auliya, which has been compiled by one of his disciples, Mir Hasan Sijzi. And if you read that book, in that book there are instances which make it very clear that the Chishtis, and particularly Nizamuddin Auliya, was against any kind of involvement in politics and state. But as against the Chishtis, the Sohrawardi's were very actively involved. Yeah. There is an instance from the time of Sultan Iltutmish that Khaja Bahauddin Zakaria, who was a Sohrawardi Sufi in Multan, and Multan at that point in time was under the control of Qobacha, who was a rival of Iltutmish. Khaja Bahauddin Zakaria actually invited Iltutmish to invade and conquer that part. So he was very interested, and upon the victory, Iltutmish offered the position of Shaykhul Islam, the leader of Islam, to Bahauddin Zakaria, and Bahauddin Zakaria readily accepted it. But contrast this with the reaction of Khaja Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, who was a Chishti Sufi, again during the same period of Iltutmish. Now Iltutmish offered him the same position and he declined. He offered him Jagir, he declined. Balban offered Jagir to Baba Farid in Pakpatan, he declined. Okay. And that is a very popular kind of confrontation between Nizamuddin Auliya and Alauddin Khalji, which everyone remembers, that when Nizamuddin Auliya sent out one of his employees and said that, ask Nizamuddin Auliya to come to my court. And Nizamuddin Auliya said that I have two doors in my dargah, in my khanqah. If Alauddin Khilji comes from one door, I'll walk away from the other.
Other two.
I just want to add one thing here, to what he's added. K. Nizami says that unfortunately, I think we can link this with the question of historiography also. The way medieval Indian history has been written, we've only used official chronicles, which were written, in the Indo-Persian tradition to oblige the rulers. They only talk of war, etc. But if we write a history of medieval India based on Maktubat and Malfuzat literature, I think we'll get a totally different picture of medieval India. And what the Sufis did, they brought a kind of religious syncretism, no doubt, but even in that whole urban revolution which had happened in the period, there was so much of uncertainty, political strife, turmoil. They brought peace in that
they settled
situation.
Certain issues.
If you look at the period, I'd like to really point out the period between 1206 to 1526. There was no such, fixed law of succession. We had 9 dynasties that had changed hands. And the only none of them had a peaceful succession. The only person who had peaceful succession was Balban and Bahlal Lodi. But then again, Balban is also accused of murder of Nasiruddin Mahmud, and Bahlal Lodi is also accused of getting the throne by deceit. So, in this period where the whole political environment was so much filled with strife, violence, civil war, it was the Sufis and the Khanqahs that really brought a moral
played a major
equilibrium
role
to
in that.
society.
Right.
Yeah.
They were the ones, who they spoke against slavery, against hoarding, against black marketing, and even, profiteering. They were against wine. In fact, Barney writes in his book that, the vices among people have reduced because of the influence of Sufis. So,
Right.
in this whole climate of medieval
But how
people,
they impacted the rulers, that's
Yeah,
a more
that's
important
also an interesting question.
interesting point.
And we also must ask this question, that why rulers were interested in Sufis.
Sufis, that's it's a vice versa.
Because the Sufis had such like a vast number of people following them, flocking to their dargah and their khanqa, and they knew that these Sufis are very popular, and they exercise some kind of social and political control and influence over people.
And they
so
impacted the policies.
they wanted Sufis on their side to gain legitimacy. And this is exactly what was happening when you mentioned Akbar, frequently visiting Khaja Muhyiddin Chishti's dargah.
Ikram, I remember like in Akbar's policy of Sulikhul is because of the Sufi.
Sufi, a large part of it.
Large
Yes.
part of
and
it.
Ikram, if you remember, R.M. Eaton also refers to warring Sufis.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
there were some Sufis who were very...
In the case of Deccan especially,
Deccan.
yeah.
He talks about them.
Eaton
and,
talks about
yes.
it.
Yeah.
Fun. Like, this polity part, like, it's a vice versa, as Ikram
Yes.
very aptly put it. Like, the rulers are interested in Chisti, Sufi orders. And the Sufism also impacted their policies and, bring in peace in the war time, in the medieval war of succession time. Rekha Pande Garu, like, Professor Rekha Pande, I just, would like to have a similarity, rather like, can we compare Sufism with Bhakti movement, because they travel together. Bhakti movement, though it started very earlier, like in the ancient times with the Veera Vaishnavism and the kind of Bhakti saints like Meera and Ramananda and Kabir and several other saints, right from Tiruvalluvar to in the south to the medieval parts. How this kind of Bhakti movement, which is as traveling together maybe or parallelly, same way they oppose the caste hierarchies, they oppose the idol worship, they opposed the kind of intermediary Brahminical priestly classes, and then they say that union with the God. So all kind of is Bhakti movement influence Sufism, or Sufism got influence of Bhakti movement? It's a kind of dialogue discussion going on in the historiographical discourses and debates. So how they impacted each other, I just want that to be.
See, like you mentioned, Bhakti movements comes at a much more earlier date, end of, in the south around 7th century, and then it spreads throughout India between 12th and 15th century. Sufism comes around 10th to 12th century.
11th.
They are also, there is a lot of similarity in them because they speak of personal devotion. They talk of, reaching God through your personal devotion. They also oppose caste hierarchies. Both of them, they were talking in terms of challenging Brahmins. And the Sufis also, rejected caste hierarchies. And they gave a lot of refuge to marginalized groups of people. In fact, their kankhas were open, the food was distributed, people stayed there. And whereas the Bhakti movement democratized Hinduism and they laid grounds for later reforms, I think the Sufis were the one who were responsible for integrating Islam into this pluralistic society. So both of them have made a major contribution. The whole faculty, they were the ones who developed patience, endurance, and they felt self-criticism is the best way to minimize the frictions in society. As I've already mentioned, this was such a volatile society. There was so much of violence, disability. They brought a peaceful environment in this society. And what is important is they understood Hinduism not in philosophical terms, but they understood Hinduism in the day-to-day practices of the people. A lot of people were welcome, they observed these practices, and many people
And we see
came,
more Hindus going to the
Good,
mosque
yes,
than
dargah.
Muslims and in the villages, like
Right, right.
And when the doors of the worship is open to them, doors of the a kind of reaching the God is open to them. A lot of Dalits and marginalized communities, including women, they were drawn to his.
So, what is important is the Sufis comprehended Hindu religion at the more psychological and emotional level rather than philosophical.
Right.
They didn't go into the details of, philosophy, and they were more interested in, what kind of practices the Hindus did, and they were most welcome.
Yes.
And they played a very major role, I think, in bringing in this equilibrium in society.
Thank you, ma'am. Having ma'am talked about this plurality, reaching the plural, marginalized. Ikram, the Sufism in Indian society is a synchronic tradition, which reached almost nook and corners of the geographical, not only areas, but also all the sections of the people. Those who are deprived of the equality, those who are segregated on the name of the caste. And India is a country of plurality, and then how the heterogeneity is the essence of Indian society, but it's not homogeneous in nature.
Right.
So how this pluralism and communal harmony is being propounded and propagated by the Sufi science, and we'll discuss about that.
Yes, in fact, I would like to highlight the point as we started the discussion very early on in this context, that the core of the Sufi philosophy is the idea of love. What in the Persian language is called ishq.
Ishq.
Now the love for God and compassion, these and this was encapsulated in philosophically in the idea of Wahdatul Wujud, which says that now when you believe in an idea that says that everyone is the creation of God and everyone can unite with God, so there is practically no distinction between God and its creation, his creation. So all these differences become immaterial. The differences of caste, religion, region, language becomes totally immaterial.
Material, yes.
Now this whole idea of love and the philosophy of Wahdatul Wujud, it acquires a social and political implication during the medieval times. Now the social implication is that you can't simply reject someone to offer him or her the best spiritual experience only because she or he follows a different religion or speaks a different language or comes from a different region. Now we have a number of examples to that effect in the Sufi literature, particularly the Malfuz literature. I'm reminded of a very interesting incident that happened in the Khanqa of Nizamuddin Aulia, which is mentioned in Fawaidul Fuad, the book of his conversation, that a Hindu brought his friend before Nizamuddin Aulia in his Khanqa and said that he is my brother. Nizamuddin Aulia says that said that I've got you in your Khanqa so that he becomes a Musalman. Now Nizamuddin Aulia says that, he says that no one's heart is changed. You may like to talk as much as you do, but no one's heart is changed. And then people who spend time in the company of good people, they become good people. He was not interested in conversion. He respected, and he said that, he is very good the way he is. And then Nizamuddin Aulia, after that incident, narrated a story of a Jew who was a neighbor of a very, very popular Sufi called Bayezid Bistami. So after Bayezid Bistami's death, that the Jew was crying, and people asked him that, why are you crying? You're a Jew. He said that, I'm crying because he was a gentleman. He was a very, very noble man. He said that, why don't you become a Muslim then? So, and Nizamuddin Aulia is narrating that story to that Hindu friend. And is trying to convince him that for a Jew, and Jew candidly said that if Islam is what Bayezid Bistami represented, then it is beyond my capacity.
Okay.
I cannot become like Bayezid Bistami. But if Islam is what you represent, I don't want to become Muslim.
That's the reason Sufis never wanted this conversion.
Never ever, because they respected local tradition, they respected local culture, they respected
That's
people.
That's the reason they become more popular among the people.
Yes.
And, yeah, thank you, Ikram. And then, ma'am, like we are talking about, like, we have to talk about the half of the population, women.
Yes.
When it comes to the women order, like, you are talking about the Bhakti movement, Mirabai, and prior to that, several Kanopatra of Maharashtra and 14th centuries around, and Meera, and Bahinabai, Soirabai, and of the Maharashtra area, and in Bangalore, like in Karnataka, Akka Mahadevi, the saint women, and Bhakta saint women, who composed the Abhangas, the poems, and rejecting the patriarchy, rejecting the caste order. They all preached the oneness with the God. So in here also we hear Hazrat Bibi and Lal Ded. Lal Ded again, Zikram's talking about. She is a Saivite.
Yes.
Saivite poet and saint, and then she also into the Sufi order, and Hazrat Bibi, Roshanara, Jahanara. Several names we hear about Hazrat Bibi, Sahiba Kala. She came from Afghan, but again in North India she made her presence with education institutions and all. Like is a Sufi order is very clearly specified rules or principles for women, or are there any women Sufi saints in the orders which we mentioned about the 4 orders? Can we have any instances of them preaching or living in this Sufi order and then preaching or reaching the people?
See, definitely something very important is, when the Sufis established their khankas, they occupied land which was unoccupied, and they derived a lot of materialistic strength from organizational and aesthetic life. And it is very important that they did not think that women were disqualified to be initiated as murids or disciples. And
nowhere it is mentioned, right? Okay.
And but what is very important is the whole process of initiation of a women Sufi was very different from a male Sufi. You find this difference in Buddhism and
Christianity,
everywhere. It was not the same. And we find, when women had to be initiated, the sheikh would first recite some hymn over a bowl of water by placing his index finger over it. And then, later on the women would also immerse her finger. And even in the 40-day chilla or the prayers which they had, there was a lot of variation placed and among the for the women. They did not have the same thing as men. But having said that, even when there were congregations, they didn't allow women to speak. Women were not allowed to speak in congregation. And like in the Bhakti movement or Hinduism, women are always seen as a illusion.
Struggle a lot
most of them. And finally, if you look at it, even Lal Ded in 14th century or Akka Mahadevi in 12th century, they walk out naked. That's the ultimate sign of protest. So Sufis also regarded women as illusion. Like in Hinduism, there are 2 major impediments to reach God, and they are, Kanak Kamini. They say Kanak is gold or wealth, possession, and second is women. But what is interesting for a man, the impediment is women, but women never looked upon men as an impediment to reach God.
Yes,
and here also, they were, what we find is they regarded women as an illusion who could delude people from reaching the right path. And what we find
But in
is a
spite
large
of that
number
also,
women mediated, you know, their whole participation was largely mediated through the shrine centered
Right.
devotion.
And
you know,
even
rather than
that
they never achieved institutional leadership in that
Right,
sense.
right,
But
right.
within the shrines they did
Yeah,
accept.
finally, Ikram, like, you know, when it comes to the, like, you know, contribution to the culture.
Right.
Sufism made an immense contribution to the music, the songs and qawwalis. So, like, you know, what is their, you know, a very unique contribution in this regard?
I think the most important contribution to my mind is the language. The Sufis, they were very conscious of the fact that if they had to communicate with people, they had to do that in their language. So you look at the Hindavi, for example, the Chishti Sufis spoke Hindavi. There are examples that Sheikh Hamiduddin Nagori, who was a Chishti Sufi, he communicated in Hindavi language. We have a very
Punjabi,
beautiful, yes, yeah, Baba Farid, Baba Farid's verses in Punjabi, and the most interesting example comes from the Deccan, where you have Khaja Banda Nawaz Gesudaraz is regarded as contributed to the Dakhani, to Urdu language. He actually wrote the first book in what is called modern day Urdu or Dakhani.
Qawwali is also.
Yeah, it's Qawwali. Amir Khusru, for example, is most famous for his contribution to music and vernacular literature and the folk songs, who is still sung in the Qawwalis today.
Yeah, thank
Even
you.
the whole you know, literature which developed in the Deccan was primarily because of the impact of the Sufis.
So far we have been discussed about like, you know, Sufism contribution and you know how what is the word Sufi, and how with their very simple living they reached the larger sections of the people, and those started as a religious, is a mysticism, but it evolved into a kind of reaching out the distressed people with their emphasis on love, devotion, direct access to God, and also spiritual learning for all, imparting spiritual learning for all. They think that, you know, they thought God's preachings or God's love is for all, irrespective of the caste, creed and religion. And they, in the social aspect also, they brought in several reforms, and radical rather. Caste oppression is being strictly opposed by them, and hierarchies, they challenge the hierarchies in the society, and there is no difference between the elite and the poor, and the caste and the dominant caste and the lower caste. So they did not see any differentiation, but preached equality, and they rather contributed for the composite culture, where, you know, a harmonious culture where, you know, Hindu and Muslim cultures went together, traveled together. Syncretism is a very related, and shared the devotional culture and music, as just now we talked about the music propagated by them. We see in the movies and rather in other Indian languages.
Right.
Sufi songs are very popular.
Sufi songs are so popular, and they are so heart touching that, you know, the major music composers are bringing out in the Sufiana. The songs are soothing the hearts of the people, and in this stressful world, like, you know, bringing soothing impact. And it has become a unique culture, and language and literature also, as they preached in the vernacular languages. Just now we are talking about the Punjab and the Sindhi, Bulesha Punjab, you know, as a famous this thing, and Sindhi Shah Abdul Latif, and Hindi and Urdu Amir Khusro. Just now we discussed about bringing about spiritual literature accessible to the local people. And education also, the Khankas acted not only as a spiritual centers, but as an education, imparting education, and all this like, you know, the Dargah culture which we see now, you know, it's a continuous process. It's not the just started in medieval times, ended with the medieval times.
Yeah, it continues.
It's a continuous, and in South Asia, the modern scholars are talking about that these coping mechanisms of you know, looking towards Sufism as a answer to the crisis, the present day world political crisis. So all this, even Oxford Research Encyclopedia also says that modern world, it's a synthesis that social, it's not only the philosophical but also the social impact that made by the Sufism in Indian society and even South Asian society.
That's very
So thank you so much, Professor Rekha Pande, ma'am. Thank you so much, Dr. Ikram, for your very elaborative and illustrious and very scholarly inputs on the aspects. I think you have covered each and every aspect of Sufism and its contribution, its geographical spread, and its impact that created in Indian society. And thank you for giving very learned inputs to our learners. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.